The city woke up slowly that morning, its skyline veiled in gray mist, its glass towers blinking like half-open eyes. Fog hugged the streets, softening the edges of everything. The street signs, the honking taxis, even the towering figure of the Hensley building that scraped against the fading night. Inside, the world was quiet, not yet filled with voices or footsteps or the constant hum of ambition. Only one sound broke the silence, the rhythmic glide of a mop over marble. Elias Carter moved like a man in prayer. Each motion was steady, deliberate, a conversation between him and the floor that had long since forgotten the sound of its own echoes. He was not old, but life had carved lines in his face that spoke of patience and the kind of quiet strength born from being unseen. The janitor's uniform hung loosely on his frame, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the faint smell of soap and polish clinging to him like a second skin. His reflection shimmered on the gleaming surface, brown skin, tired eyes, a man who had learned to find peace in repetition. He hummed softly under his breath, an old hymn his grandmother used to sing when she scrubbed kitchens for families who never bothered to learn her name. Somewhere between the low hum and the slow sweep of his mop, Elias found a rhythm that felt like home. He paused, leaned against his cart, and looked through the tall glass windows. The city outside glowed faintly, its horizon split between light and shadow. Above him, on the 42nd floor, where the light stayed on long after the rest of the city slept, another man stood before the same sunrise. Charles Hensley looked out from his office with the confidence of a man who believed he had conquered the view. The reflection, staring back at him, was dressed in wealth silk tie, tailored suit, and the smug stillness of someone who had long forgotten what struggle felt like. His office was silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock that cost more than most people made in a month. He liked mornings like this, the city subdued, the world his to shape before it fully woke. Every gleaming surface in that office reminded him of victory. The framed photo behind his desk showed him on opening day, scissors in hand, smile sharp as a blade. Behind him, the crowd had cheered, not because they loved him, but because they feared falling out of his orbit. That was how power worked. It didn't have to be loved, only obeyed. Down below, Elias wrung out his mop and pushed his car toward the elevator. The day was beginning, and soon the silence would be replaced by the stampede of shoes, the laughter of people with plans. He had none. His world existed in the quiet between others' ambitions. Still, as the elevator climbed, his mind moved elsewhere, to sketches waiting for him at home, blueprints drawn on notebook paper, dreams he could never quite let go. When the doors opened on the executive floor, the air changed. It always did. It smelled expensive, leather, oak, and something chemical he could never name. The lights here were softer, the carpets thicker. He walked down the hall, mop, bucket squeaking against marble, until he reached the glass doors that read Charles Hensley, Chief Executive Officer. He hesitated. There were voices inside. He could hear Hensley talking, fast and irritated. "I don't want excuses, Blake," Charles said to his assistant. "I want results. The Avery Tower is outshining us again. Investors don't care about tradition, they care about spectacle. We need something iconic, something that screams innovation." His assistant murmured agreement. "Should I contact Crenshaw and Myers?" "No," Charles snapped. "I'm not hiring anyone who makes me look like I'm following trends. We'll find someone better, someone who sees the future the way I do." He poured himself a glass of mineral water and stared at his reflection in the window. "That's the difference between visionaries and dreamers," he said. Elias had been standing just outside the door, waiting for a pause. When the silence came, he knocked softly. The assistant opened it with a glance that said, "Make it quick." Elias entered quietly, keeping to the edges of the room. His mop moved soundlessly across the floor. The office shimmered, bookshelves lined with trophies, a desk polished like glass, and walls of glass overlooking a city that didn't know his name. He didn't mind. The work was honest. Charles turned suddenly. "Carter, right?" he asked, his voice clipped but curious. Elias nodded. "Yes, sir. How long you been here?" 10 years, sir." 10 years. Charles sipped his water. "Tell me, don't you ever wish you'd done something else?" Elias hesitated. "I did once," he said. "Still do, sometimes." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what dream is that?" Elias smiled faintly. "I wanted to be an engineer, sir. Maybe design buildings like this one." There was a moment of stillness, and then the laughter came, short, sharp, and cold. The assistant laughed too, nervously at first, then louder, as if to match his boss. "An engineer," Charles repeated. "Well, Carter, dreams are nice, but dreams don't pay rent." The laughter bounced off the glass, filled every corner of the room, and settled on Elias like dust. He lowered his eyes. "No, sir," he said quietly. "They don't." Charles waved a hand, already bored. "Carry on." Elias finished cleaning in silence. The air felt heavier, the light colder. When he stepped back into the hallway, he stood for a long time staring at his reflection in the glass wall. He could still hear the laughter, faint but sharp, echoing in his chest. He pressed a hand to the cool surface and whispered, under his breath, "One day they'll see." Downstairs, the lobby buzzed with life. People hurried in with coffee cups and briefcases, eyes fixed on the elevators. No one noticed the janitor leaving, his steps quiet against the marble he had polished to perfection. Outside, the city had fully awakened. Sunlight struck the Hensley building, turning its mirrored surface into a shard of light. Elias looked up, shielding his eyes. The structure was beautiful, tall, sleek, confident. But as he studied its angles, his mind saw flaws invisible to others. The airflow was inefficient. The materials aged too quickly. The structure could have been stronger, lighter, greener. He saw not a monument to success, but a design that could have been better. That thought alone was enough to make him smile. The city roared around him, but in his mind he was already drawing. The idea had always lived inside him, even when the world laughed. He turned and began walking home through streets still damp from rain. His shoes splashed through shallow puddles that reflected skyscrapers like broken dreams. At his apartment, a narrow one-room space above a laundromat, he sat at a small wooden table and unrolled a sheet of paper. On it, lines intersected in quiet symmetry, windows, beams, and arches born from memory and faith. His hands moved automatically, tracing new possibilities. For hours he worked, lost in the gentle scratch of pencil against paper. Outside, the world moved fast, cars honking, people shouting, deals being made, but in that tiny room, time slowed. The light shifted from gold to gray to blue. He drew until his hand ached, until his heart felt lighter. And when he was done, he looked at the finished sketch and whispered again, softly but certain, "One day, they'll see." The city was fully alive by the time Elias made it back to work the next morning. Horns blared. From every corner, construction crews shouted over each other, and people moved like clockwork. Each step measured, each goal invisible but urgent. He walked the same route. Every day, passing the same bakery with the same sweet smell, the same doorman who never said good morning, and the same bronze plaque at the base of the Hensley building that read, "Founded 1998, Charles Hensley." The letters were spotless because Elias polished them every week. Funny, he thought, how something so clean could hide so much dirt. Inside, the world he served spun like a machine. Suits and ties, pencil skirts and shining shoes, all blending into the choreography of ambition. The elevator doors opened and closed like breathing. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone except Elias. He clocked in with a nod to the security guard, rode his cart to the service elevator, and disappeared into the building's veins, the places no one looked, but everyone relied on. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him. The air smelled of bleach and faint traces of cologne from offices upstairs. As he mopped and wiped, his mind wandered somewhere brighter. He thought of steel beams and skylights, of air that moved naturally through spaces, of buildings that breathed instead of suffocated. He didn't just dream of architecture, he saw it. Every pipe, every vent, every wall spoke to him like language. He could read its rhythm, its flaws, its potential. He didn't need blueprints. The building itself was his classroom. He worked his way through the lower floors first, the ones full of accountants and analysts who never noticed him, but always noticed a smudge on the floor. By 9, he was in the main lobby, polishing the edges of the marble steps. People walked past him as though he were part of the decor. He'd long stopped expecting otherwise. But when a young intern dropped his coffee near the front desk, Elias was there before it hit the floor, kneeling with a rag, silent as breath. "Oh man, thanks," the intern said awkwardly, glancing down at the older man. I didn't see you there." Elias smiled faintly. "Most people don't." The boy laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke. When he left, Elias watched him go, remembering when he too had been young and hungry and certain that life was something he could design. After his shift, he went home and sat again at his small table, the paper before him waiting like an open door. He had saved up for months to buy drafting tools from a pawn shop, used rulers, worn pencils, a second-hand compass missing its tip. To anyone else, they were junk. To Elias, they were relics of who he might have been. He began sketching again, lines flowing with confidence, the kind that comes from love, not education. His newest design was different, a building that wasn't about power, but about people. It had open gardens and curved walls that caught light like hands catching rain. He imagined families walking through it, workers finding peace there, a space where glass and steel served humanity instead of pride. When he finished, he sat back, looked at his creation, and felt that old ache again, the one that came when beauty had nowhere to go. That night, as he tried to sleep, the city hummed outside his window. He dreamed of an office full of architects debating designs, of his drawings laid across a conference table, of his name whispered with respect. But every time he reached for that moment, the laughter returned. Same echo from Charles Hensley's office. Dreams don't pay rent. He woke before dawn, the words still hanging in his head like cobwebs. He didn't know it yet, but the universe has a strange way of listening to those who whisper their truth. A few floors above where Elias worked, in a conference room lined with screens and plans, a new project had just been announced. Hensley Industries was planning to build a second tower, something taller, grander, more visionary. Charles wanted a landmark that would make the city bow. The problem was, none of the architects he'd hired impressed him. Every design felt like an echo of something already done. "These people think glass and height make a building," he said to his board. "But I want a structure that commands attention before you even see it." He turned to his daughter Grace, who sat quietly at the end of the table. "You studied architecture," he said. "What do you think?" Grace hesitated. "I think the problem isn't the buildings," she said softly. "It's the purpose. Everyone's designing for ego, not empathy." Her father laughed. "Empathy doesn't sell, sweetheart." Grace didn't argue. She'd learned long ago that Charles didn't like being questioned. But inside, her mother's voice still lived, a voice that had believed in compassion over conquest. Grace had inherited that heart, and though she worked inside her father's empire, she was not part of its hunger. Down below, while Charles debated profit margins and prestige, Elias swept dust from under tables where those decisions were made. He found an abandoned notepad in a corner, half filled with sketches, most of them crude outlines for the new tower. He stared at them for a moment, then quietly tucked them into his pocket. That night, at home, he studied them under lamplight. The designs were predictable, tall, angular, soulless. So he did what came naturally. He began to redraw. He kept the structure, but gave it life. He added symmetry that calmed the eye, angles that caught sunlight just so, corridors that funneled air like melody. He worked through the night, erasing, reimagining, refining. When the sun rose, his version of the Hensley Tower was nothing short of breathtaking. It was the building he'd always wanted to build, one that gave back to the city instead of towering over it. He stared at it until tears blurred the lines. "This," he whispered, "this is what building should feel like." He didn't know that fate was already setting its wheels in motion. The next morning, Grace walked through the lobby, coffee in hand, on her way to a meeting. Her heel slipped on a faint streak of polish Elias had missed. The cup fell, coffee splattering across the floor. Elias appeared instantly, rag in hand. "I'm so sorry, miss," he said, kneeling. "My mistake." Grace waved him off. "No, please, it's my fault. I wasn't looking." As he cleaned, she noticed the rolled paper sticking from his cart. "What's that?" she asked. He froze. "Just drawings," he said. "For what?" "Nothing important." She tilted her head. "May I see?" He hesitated, then handed it to her. When she unrolled it, her breath caught. "You did this?" He nodded, embarrassed. "It's just something I do. Help me think." She studied the lines, the precision, the elegance. "This is beautiful," she said quietly. "Better than half the submissions we've seen." He smiled sadly. "Maybe in another life." She rolled it back up carefully. "Maybe in this one." That single moment changed everything. Grace didn't know it yet, but she just discovered a vision her father's world had forgotten. And Elias, though he didn't dare believe it, had just found the first person who truly saw him. Charles Hensley lived in a world built on marble floors and glass walls, a kingdom of his own design, where reflection mattered more than reality. He believed that power was a language only. A few were born to speak, and he had mastered it early. Every morning, he arrived at his office before sunrise, stood at the window, and watched the city wake up beneath him. He liked to think of the buildings as chess pieces, each one placed by men like him, strategic, ambitious, ruthless. From up there, the people looked like ants, useful, replaceable, necessary only as long as they moved in the right direction. To Charles, wealth wasn't money, it was control, the power to decide who was seen and who wasn't. The irony was that in all his success, he'd forgotten what it felt like to dream without ownership, to build something not for profit, but for meaning. He walked through the office halls like a general surveying his soldiers. Employees straightened their backs when he passed, smiling too hard, laughing too quickly. He enjoyed that. It was respect wrapped in fear, and he needed both. His company had become an empire of steel and contracts, and his name. Hensley stood on buildings from coast to coast, but lately he had begun to feel the quiet bite of insecurity. Competition was closing in. Other companies were building higher, smarter, greener. For a man like him, second place wasn't an option. Grace, his daughter, saw the cracks that no one else dared to notice. She'd grown up in the shadow of her father's empire, watching him turn kindness into weakness, watching him lose himself in the chase for more. Her degree in architecture had been her way of understanding him, or maybe escaping him. But even she couldn't deny the way his ambition had built the skyline that shaped their world. He was both the dream and the nightmare of success. At the weekly board meeting, Charles stood before his executives, his voice filling the glass room like thunder. This company was built on vision, he said, gesturing toward the city below. But vision fades when we get comfortable. Avery Group is beating us to contracts we should own. Their new tower is on every magazine cover in the country. We're not just losing business, we're losing relevance. He paused, letting the silence tighten. That ends now. We need something extraordinary, something no one has ever seen before. A senior board member cleared his throat. Sir, we've been in talks with several top firms. Crenshaw and Myers submitted a preliminary design that... Crenshaw and Myers? Charles interrupted. I don't want safe. I don't want predictable. I want a building that makes people stop in the street and stare. I want art that feels like dominance. Grace, seated near the end of the table, spoke up. Maybe what people need isn't another tower that makes them feel small. The room went still. Everyone turned to her. Maybe it's time we build something that feels alive, that gives something back to the city instead of just taking space from it. Her father smiled, the way a lion smiles at the mouse that forgot its place. That's poetic, Grace. But poetry doesn't raise profits. It might raise people, she replied softly. Charles looked at her for a long moment before waving the thought away. Gentlemen, let's focus. We'll review designs this week. Bring me something that looks impossible. When the meeting ended, Grace lingered behind. Dad, she said carefully, what if the right design doesn't come from where you expect? He adjusted his cufflinks without looking at her. If it's good, I'll buy it. If it's bad, it's irrelevant. That's how business works. She wanted to argue, but didn't. She had spent her whole life trying to show him that empathy wasn't weakness, that vision could come from humility. But Charles Hensley didn't believe in humility. He believed in names etched in stone. Down in the lobby, Elias mopped quietly near the elevators, the same rag in his hand that he'd used for years, his mind lost in sketches he couldn't afford to print. When Grace passed by, she smiled at him. Good morning, Mr. Carter. He froze, mopped mid-air. No one had ever said his name with such respect. Good morning, Miss Hensley, he replied softly. She glanced around, making sure no one saw them, then lowered her voice. I've been thinking about your drawings. Would you show me more? He hesitated. They're just ideas. Good ideas, she said. Sometimes that's all it takes. That night, Elias spread his sketches on the table in his small apartment. The walls were bare. The only decoration, a shelf filled with folded paper years of designs that never left the room. When Grace knocked at his door hours later, she stood out like sunlight in shadow. She stepped inside carefully, her heels clicking against the worn tile. You leave here? She whispered. He nodded. It's enough. She looked at the table, at the papers covered in lines and shapes that spoke a language she knew too well. "These are remarkable," she said, tracing one blueprint with her finger. "You understand balance better than most architects I've met." Elias smiled faintly. "Balance keeps buildings standing, same as people." Grace looked up, meeting his eyes. "Do you know what would happen if my father saw this?" He laughed quietly. "I'd lose my job." She sat with him for hours, asking questions about airflow, light, purpose. He explained his ideas, his belief that architecture was a form of mercy, a way to build hope into the world. She'd never heard anyone speak of design that way. It moved her. "Have you ever thought about submitting these?" she asked. Elias shook his head. "They'd see my name and throw them away." Grace was silent for a moment, then said, "What if they didn't know it was yours?" He looked at her, confused. She smiled. "You let me submit them under a different name." He hesitated, torn between fear and wonder. "Why would you do that?" "Because my father's looking for something extraordinary," she said, "and I think he's already standing on it." She left that night with his drawings rolled under her arm, her heart racing. For the first time in years, she felt like she was part of something real. And Elias, sitting alone after she left, felt something too, hope. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that hums low and steady, waiting for its moment. The next morning, Charles arrived at his office to find a new design proposal on his desk. The name on the cover read E. Carter Designs. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. The lines were unlike anything he'd seen, fluid, intelligent, human. "Who submitted this?" he asked his assistant. "Anonymous submission," the man replied. Came through the open portal. Charles stared at the drawings again, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "This," he murmured, "this is it." He didn't know that the hands that held his mop had also built his future. And for the first time, the building that would carry his name was born not from wealth, but from the quiet genius of the man who cleaned his floors. Charles Hensley prided himself on being a man of vision, a builder of legacies, someone whose name meant power. He had carved his success from the bones of competition, risen from a modest background into a skyline of steel and glass that bore his signature. To him, failure was a myth, humility an inconvenience, and dreams were only worth pursuing if they made profit. But there was something about the anonymous design of E. Carter that made him restless. It was too good, too deliberate. It understood structure and soul in equal measure. It didn't shout for attention like the others. It invited it. For a man who measured worth in applause, that quiet mastery felt almost suspicious. The mystery of its creator began to consume him. He wanted to own it, but more than that, he wanted to understand it. Who was E. Carter? He had his assistant search every database, every firm, every registry. Nothing. No website, no portfolio, no public presence. "Whoever this is," he muttered one night, pacing his office, "they either don't exist or don't want to." His reflection stared back at him from the window, the city lights glinting off his glass walls. "And everyone wants to be found," he said to himself. Grace watched from the doorway. She had grown used to her father's obsessions, but this one felt different. There was admiration in his voice, a rare thing for Charles Hensley. "Maybe," she said carefully, "you should let the work speak for itself." He turned sharply. "In my world, Grace, names build empires." She wanted to tell him that not all greatness demanded a spotlight, but he wouldn't understand. So she said nothing. Meanwhile, Elias lived in his world of silence and dust. The building's hum had become his companion, its walls his audience. He knew which elevators groaned, which pipes leaked, which tiles hid tiny cracks invisible to anyone else. But lately, when he swept, his eyes kept drifting upward to the posters and news clippings pinned across the lobby announcing the new Hensley Tower. His tower. The one built from his hands and heart, even if no one knew it. Sometimes he'd stop mid-cleaning and just look at the artist's renderings. His design stood tall in the pictures, sunlight curling around its glass like forgiveness. He'd smile to himself, proud yet cautious. One day, he whispered, "The truth will find its own way out." And truth, like time, has perfect timing. Construction began in early spring. The city buzzed with excitement. Reporters called it the most groundbreaking design of the decade. The anonymous architect became a mystery people couldn't stop talking about. Interviews, theories, debates. It was all anyone in architecture cared about. Charles ate up the attention. He toured the site in hard hats and designer shoes, giving statements about innovation and future legacy. Cameras followed his every step. Vision, he said to a reporter, isn't just about seeing what others can't. It's about daring to claim it. Behind that polished quote was a flicker of unease. Because as much as he loved owning things, this design refused to feel owned. It was too human, too soulful. Even he could sense it. Weeks passed. The building climbed higher, steel and glass reaching toward the clouds like prayer. Elias would sometimes walk by after hours, watching the framework glow in the sunset. He didn't go close. He didn't need to. Just seeing it rise was enough. He'd smile, shake his head, and keep walking. That was his masterpiece, and even if his name was hidden behind an initial, his spirit lived in every beam. But fate is not kind to pride. As the tower neared completion, the board arranged a ceremony to install the final dedication plaque before the grand opening. Charles arrived early, dressed immaculate as ever, with his gold cufflinks gleaming under the afternoon sun. Workers stood ready. Cameras were set. A crane lowered the bronze plaque into position. "Let's see it before it's mounted," Charles said, holding out his hand. The worker handed it over. The sunlight struck the engraved words, clear and bold. Designed by Elias Carter. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The air thickened. The weight of the plaque seemed to double in his hands. The name burned into his eyes. Elias Carter. He blinked, as though the letters might rearrange themselves into something acceptable. They didn't. "Who approved this?" he snapped. The site manager stammered. "It came from corporate, sir." The final blueprints listed his full name, Elias Carter. Charles's throat went dry. His memory flashed. 10 years of walking past that man, barely acknowledging him, laughing when he spoke of dreams. His voice cracked. This can't be right." Grace's voice came from behind him. "It's right." He turned slowly. She stood there, calm and unflinching. "You knew?" he said, low and dangerous. "Yes. Why?" His face darkened, pride clawing for a foothold. "Because he earned it," she said simply. "Because the man you laughed at built something even you couldn't imagine." He tried to speak, but no words came. He turned the plaque over in his hands, running his fingers across the engraved letters. They felt sharp, real. His reflection in the bronze looked small, smaller than he had ever seen himself. "He's a janitor," he whispered. Grace stepped closer. "He's an architect. You just never looked closely enough to see it." The workers stood silent, sensing history in the making. Charles's face hardened, then softened, the storm inside him collapsing into quiet. "Bring him here," he said. Within the hour, Elias was escorted to the site. He came in his uniform, sleeves rolled, hands still smelling faintly of polish. He didn't look nervous. He looked steady, as if he'd been waiting for this day all his life. Charles approached him slowly, the plaque tucked under his arm. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of machinery filled the air. Charles broke first. "You designed this," he said. "Not a question, a truth." Elias nodded. "I did." "Why didn't you tell me?" Elias smiled faintly. "You wouldn't have believed me." Charles exhaled a long, trembling breath. "You're right," he admitted. "I wouldn't have." They stood in silence, the tower's shadow stretching over them both. Then Charles held out the plaque. "This belongs to you." Elias shook his head. "No, sir. It belongs to everyone who believed they weren't enough. I just built it for them." Grace's eyes glistened. Workers lowered their hats. Cameras clicked, capturing a man the world had ignored standing beside the monument he created. For the first time in his life, Hensley felt something he didn't recognize. Humility. And it felt right. That evening, long after the workers left, he walked the empty halls of the new tower. Every line and corner spoke with quiet grace, every detail a reminder of the man he'd underestimated. When he reached the lobby, he stopped before the plaque, now mounted near the entrance, designed by Elias Carter. He touched the name, feeling its weight. For once, he didn't think about legacy or profit. He thought about what it meant to be seen. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the glass. Somewhere below, in the original Hensley building, Elias mopped the same marble floors with the same rhythm as always. But this time, his reflection in the glass looked taller. The janitor who dreamed had built a dream that outlived laughter. And for Charles Hensley, the man who once mocked him, the lesson carved deeper than the name on the wall. Some dreams don't beg to be believed. They build themselves until belief has no choice. When the dust of revelation settled, the story of Elias Carter spread through the company like wildfire. People whispered his name in hallways where his presence had once been invisible. The janitor who designed the Hensley Tower. Some said it was impossible, others said it was inspiring. But everyone agreed on one thing. The world had changed the moment the truth was carved in bronze. For the first time, Elias didn't have to lower his gaze when he walked through the building. The same executives who once brushed past him now greeted him with quiet awe. But Elias hadn't changed. He still arrived before dawn, still worked with care, still believed that respect was something you earned through integrity, not applause. He wasn't after fame, he was after meaning. Grace convinced her father to hold the press conference, though Charles resisted. "It's not good for business," he said, pacing his office. "No one wants to invest in a company that looks like it, didn't recognize genius under its own roof." Grace replied, "No one wants to invest in arrogance either." Her voice was calm, but the truth stung. "This isn't just about him," she added. "It's about redemption." That word landed like a hammer on stone. Redemption. It echoed in Charles's mind for days. When he finally agreed, he did it not for publicity, but for peace. Somewhere, between guilt and admiration, he had realized that the building meant nothing if the man behind it stayed in the shadows. The press conference was held in the grand lobby of the Hensley Tower, the light pouring through the glass facade, turning the space golden. Reporters filled every inch of marble floor. Cameras clicked as Charles stepped up to the podium, the weight of humility visible in his posture. "When this company started," he began, "I thought I understood success. I thought it was about numbers, growth, and legacy. But a man named Elias Carter reminded me that real success begins with vision, and vision can come from anywhere. He paused, his voice unsteady. I once mocked his dream. Today, I stand inside it. The crowd murmured, touched by the honesty in his words. So from this day forward, Charles continued, Elias Carter will not only be recognized as the designer of this building, but as the director of innovation at Hensley Industries. Gasps filled the room. Elias, standing at the edge of the crowd, looked stunned. Grace smiled at him, motioning him forward. The crowd parted as he walked to the stage, his work boots echoing softly. When he reached the podium, he didn't look nervous. He simply looked alive. I'm not much for speeches, he said quietly, but I'll say this. Every dream has a place. It just needs someone to stop sweeping past it long enough to see. The audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. For once, the light didn't blind him, it revealed him. The weeks that followed were a blur. Articles praised his humility. Interviews called him the man who built his own miracle. He became a symbol of hope for workers everywhere, proof that brilliance didn't wear suits. Yet, through it all, Elias remained grounded. He still rode the same bus, still lived in his small apartment, though now the walls were covered in blueprints and awards. But it wasn't recognition that kept him up at night, it was possibility. For years, his ideas had lived and died on scraps of paper. Now he had resources, tools, people who wanted to listen. And he didn't want to waste that gift. He began mentoring young interns at Hensley Industries, most of them from the same neighborhoods he came from. Kids who had ideas but no platform. He taught them not just architecture, but courage. Blueprints, he told them, are just dreams on paper. You make them real by refusing to give up when the world tells you no. His classes grew, then evolved into a foundation. Grace helped him establish it officially, the Carter Initiative, dedicated to helping underprivileged youth pursue careers in engineering and design. Meanwhile, Charles watched from afar, pride and regret mingling like oil and water. The tower that bore his name had become a monument to a man he once mocked. But instead of bitterness, he found gratitude. He saw in Elias something he'd lost years ago, a pure, fearless love for creation. And in Grace he saw the reflection of everything good he'd ever done, magnified by her compassion. One evening, Charles visited the tower after hours. The building was quiet except for the hum of lights and the faint sound of Elias's voice echoing from an upper floor. He followed it and found him in a small classroom, surrounded by young students scribbling notes. Elias was sketching on a whiteboard, explaining balance and light. Charles leaned in the doorway unnoticed, listening. When the session ended, Elias saw him. For a moment, both men simply stood there. "You came," Elias said. Charles nodded. "I had to see it for myself. What you've built here." He looked around the room. "You turned my building into something worth being proud of." Elias smiled. "It was always worth it. It just needed purpose." Charles stepped closer, his voice low. "I owe you an apology." Elias shook his head. "You already gave me something better." "What's that?" "A chance." The two men stood in silence, the kind that doesn't need words. Charles looked up at the ceiling, at the light filtering through the glass. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think buildings were made of steel and money. Turns out they're built from belief." Then maybe we finally built the same thing. When Charles left that night, he paused at the entrance where the plaque gleamed. He traced the engraved letters, designed by Elias Carter, and whispered, "Thank you." For the first time in his life, the man who once ruled from glass towers felt small in the best way possible. Elias watched him go, the reflection of the city lights flickering across the lobby floor. He thought about how far he'd come, how far they all had. A janitor had taught a tycoon humility, a daughter had taught her father grace, and a dream once mocked had become the foundation for others to build upon. That night he stood alone in the middle of the lobby, looking up at the ceiling that caught the stars like a net of light. He whispered to himself, "It's never too late to dream." And for the first time, he believed not just in the dream, but in the world's ability to see it. The seasons changed, but the glow around the Hensley Tower never faded. What began as a headline became a legend, and the name Elias Carter traveled far beyond the walls of that building. To the city, he was the man who proved genius doesn't wear titles. To the people who worked beside him, he was still the same Elias. Quiet, humble, steady, but now with an aura that even silence couldn't contain. His days were longer, filled with meetings, design sessions, and mentorship programs, but he carried it all with calm grace. He wasn't chasing success, he was planting it. Each sketch, each conversation with a student, each blueprint he refined was part of something bigger, a movement. The Carter Initiative had grown fast, spreading to schools across the city. Every Saturday, Elias stood before classrooms full of kids who reminded him of himself. Bright eyes, restless minds, and small hands clutching pencils like magic wands. He told them that the world was built by dreamers who refused to stop believing in what they saw. A building, he'd say, is just a dream that learned how to stand. The kids laughed, but they understood. They listened to the man who'd once been invisible, now shining not through wealth, but through purpose. Grace became the heart of the initiative's operations. She left her father's company to help Elias full-time, managing grants, partnerships, and outreach. Her compassion gave his vision structure. Together, they were unstoppable. A partnership built not on business, but on belief. She often told him, "You gave the world a tower, but what you're building now will outlast it." Elias smiled when she said that, because deep down, he knew it was true. The Hensley Tower was steel and glass, but the foundation of the Carter Initiative was hope, and hope never erodes. Charles Hensley, now in his late 60s, began to slow down. The empire he had built still stood tall, but he no longer cared for numbers or charts. His pride had melted into perspective. He spent most mornings visiting the tower, walking its halls in quiet reflection. The staff greeted him differently now, not with fear, but with genuine warmth. They saw the change in him, the humility in his voice, the softened edge in his eyes. When reporters asked what had caused it, he always said, "A man who once worked for me taught me what leadership really means." One afternoon, Charles visited one of Elias's classrooms unannounced. The children were crowded around the tables, drawing tiny buildings with crayons and rulers. Elias looked up and smiled when he saw him. "You came." Charles nodded, his eyes scanning the walls covered in sketches. "I had to see what you've been doing." He picked up one of the drawings, a crooked but creative sketch of a city skyline drawn by a boy no older than 8. "You're teaching them to build?" Elias nodded. "I'm teaching them to see." Charles studied the drawing again. "You know, I spent my whole life building towers I thought would make people look up to me. You've built something that makes people look within themselves." Elias smiled faintly. "That's the difference between legacy and ego. One feeds you, the other feeds the world." They sat in silence for a while, watching the kids at work. There was peace in that room. the kind that can't be bought, only earned. As Charles left, he turned to Elias and said, "If I could start over, I'd want to build what you've built." Elias shook his hand firmly. "You still can. Start by believing in someone who's been overlooked." Charles nodded, the words settling deep in his chest. A few months later, tragedy struck quietly, as it always does. Charles passed away in his sleep. The news spread through the city like the end of an era. His funeral was grand, attended by mayors, executives, and workers alike. But it wasn't his wealth that drew people in. It was the man he'd become before the end. Grace delivered the eulogy. Her voice was steady but soft. "My father taught me how to build towers," she said. "But in the end, he learned how to build bridges. He found peace not in what he owned, but in what he gave back." Elias stood in the back, his hat pressed to his chest. He remembered their last conversation and the look in Charles's eyes, not of power, but of understanding. When the service ended, he approached Grace. She hugged him without a word. "He respected you," she whispered, "more than anyone." Elias nodded. "I respected him too. Sometimes the hardest thing to build is a better version of yourself." He did that. After the funeral, Grace insisted on renaming the tower. At first, Elias refused. "Your father built this company. His name should stay." Grace shook her head. "He'd want this." Months later, the bronze plaque at the base of the tower was replaced. The new one read, "The Hensley Carter Tower, a vision of unity, built from redemption and hope." The dedication ceremony was simple but powerful. The crowd watched as Grace unveiled the new plaque, the sun glinting off its surface. "This tower," she said, "was born from two men, one who believed in power and one who believed in purpose. Together, they built something neither could have built alone." Elias stood to the side, hands clasped, his eyes reflecting the golden light. The applause rolled like thunder, but his mind was quiet. He thought of the first day he'd walked through those doors, the weight of a mop in his hands, and the sound of laughter that had once made him feel small. Now, the same halls echoed with his name, not because he demanded it, but because he'd earned it. That evening, after everyone left, he wandered the halls one last time. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows through the glass. He stopped before the plaque, tracing his name with a finger. He whispered, "We did it," though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Charles, to Grace, or to the dream itself. Then he looked up, and for the first time, he didn't see the tower as a monument. He saw it as a promise, a reminder that even the smallest voices can build something eternal if they never stop believing in the sound of their own hope. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, each one a heartbeat in the living skyline he had helped shape. And for Elias Carter, the man who once scrubbed floors dreaming of blueprints, the world finally looked exactly as he had imagined, full of light, balance, and second chances. The following spring arrived soft and golden, the kind of season that seemed to carry the scent of rebirth through the air. The Hensley Carter Tower glimmered in the morning light, standing tall not as a symbol of power anymore, but as a living testament to the kind of change that can only come from humility. Tourists stopped to take photos, but the locals no longer saw it as just architecture. They spoke about it like it was a person, one who had learned, forgiven, and grown. Inside, the Carter Initiative had expanded, filling entire floors with classrooms, design labs, and open workspaces for students who had once believed college was a dream too expensive to afford. Every wall was filled with color, murals drawn by those same kids who had grown up under its influence. The air smelled like graphite and possibility. Elias moved through the building like a quiet guardian, always with his sleeves rolled, pencil behind his ear, and a soft smile that made even the shyest student relax. His office was nothing more than a corner desk with sunlight spilling across piles of paper, sketches scattered like fallen leaves. Titles didn't matter to him. He still cleaned his own space, still walked the halls before dawn, still took the bus on mornings. He didn't see it as modesty, it was memory. It reminded him where he began. Grace often teased him for it. "You could have an entire floor to yourself, you know," she said one morning, leaning on the doorframe as he straightened stacks of notebooks. He grinned. "Why would I need that when I've got the whole world right here?" She laughed softly. "You really don't know how to stop working." "When the work is love," he said, "rest feels like waste." Their friendship had become something sacred, a partnership of souls who had found the same truth through different pain. Grace had taken over most of the logistics for the initiative, traveling across the country to open new chapters. Every time she returned, she brought new faces and new stories, students who reminded Elias that what they'd started had grown far beyond either of them. "Do you realize," she said once, looking out over the lobby where dozens of children sat drawing, "that this building might outlive us all?" Elias nodded. "Good. That's how you know you built something right." One day, an invitation arrived on his desk. The city council wanted to honor him with a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to architecture and education. The ceremony would be held at the Civic Center, broadcast live. He smiled when he read it, but part of him hesitated. He'd never done any of this for applause. When he told Grace, she was thrilled. "You have to go, Elias. It's not about fame, it's about showing them what's possible." He sighed, then smiled. "I guess it's about time I let the world know I still exist." The night of the ceremony, the auditorium glowed with gold light and murmuring voices. Architects, teachers, students all gathered to celebrate the man whose name had once been nothing but a whisper in a janitor's schedule book. When Elias walked onto the stage, the crowd stood. The applause went on for nearly a minute. He waited until it faded, then leaned toward the microphone, his voice calm but full. "I used to think dreams were fragile," he began. "I used to think they belonged to people born in the right zip code, with the right degree, the right suit. But dreams," he paused, "don't care where you start. They only care that you don't stop." The room grew quiet. "The world once told me that janitors don't build towers, but I stand here tonight because one day I stopped believing them, and because one man I once called my boss." He smiled softly, chose to listen instead of laugh. He looked toward Grace in the front row, and because a woman brave enough to believe in a stranger decided that compassion was stronger than pride. "If there's anything I've learned, it's this: greatness doesn't live at the top of a tower. It lives in the hands that build it." The audience rose again, the sound of applause filling the space like a tide. Grace wiped a tear from her cheek. After the ceremony, as he stepped outside into the cool night, reporters crowded him with questions, but he only answered one. A young student asked, "Mr. Carter, do you ever get tired of proving people wrong?" Elias chuckled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I don't prove people wrong, son," he said. "I prove dreams right." The next day he returned to the tower and went back to work as if nothing had changed. That was how he preferred it. But the truth was, everything had changed. His story had become a lesson in schools, his designs studied by architects who finally recognized the genius that had been sweeping their floors. Yet the recognition didn't weigh him down. It lifted him. He used it to open new doors, to build spaces where creativity didn't depend on privilege. Months later, Grace organized the first Carter Scholars Gala, a celebration for the students who had graduated through their program. The lobby of the tower transformed into a ballroom, strings of warm lights crisscrossing the high ceilings. The air buzzed with laughter, music, and the smell of food. Children he'd once taught were now adults, engineers, architects, artists. They surrounded him, sharing stories of their first jobs, their own projects, their dreams. One young woman hugged him tightly and whispered, "You changed everything for us." He smiled, touched her shoulder, and said, "No, you did. I just opened the door." As the night ended, he stepped outside with Grace. The city stretched before them, glittering and alive. "You ever think," she said quietly, "about what would have happened if we'd never met?" He looked up at the tower, its glass catching the starlight. "I think we were meant to," he said. "Some dreams aren't coincidences, they are assignments." They stood in silence, the hum of the city like a heartbeat around them. For a man who had once been invisible, the world now saw him everywhere. But the truth was, Elias Carter had never needed to be seen. He just needed to be believed. And now, every brick, every classroom, every young dreamer in the tower was proof that belief, once planted, could grow. Taller than glass, brighter than steel, and stronger than any laughter that ever tried to silence it. The years that followed unfolded like a second sunrise in Elias Carter's life. He had built more than structures. He had built people, and through them, an entire generation of dreamers who carried his story like scripture. The Carter Initiative had grown beyond the city, spreading across states, reaching small towns where kids still believed that success was a stranger's word. Wherever a young person felt unseen, his name reached them first, spoken softly like hope. And though time had begun to slow him, Elias never stopped moving. His hair had turned silver, his back a little bent, but his eyes, those sharp, soulful eyes, still carried the same light that once drew blueprints by candlelight in a tiny apartment above a laundromat. He spent most mornings in the tower's garden terrace, sipping coffee while the city yawned, awake beneath him. The wind carried the scent of earth and rain, and sometimes laughter from the classrooms below. He'd smile, knowing that his fingerprints were now woven into the rhythm of this city. He wasn't just part of its skyline, he was part of its pulse. Grace joined him often, her presence as constant as the morning light. They didn't speak much during those moments. They didn't have to. Years of shared battles and victories had made silence between them sacred. She'd often look at him and say, "You know, you've become what this building was, always meant to represent." He'd chuckle softly. "And what's that?" "Grace," she'd say with a knowing smile, "in the shape of steel." Elias had always believed that architecture was more than design, it was emotion carved into permanence. And in the final years of his life, he poured that belief into one last project. He called it the People's Place, a public library and community center meant to serve the very neighborhoods that had raised him. "It's not going to scrape the sky," he said to Grace one afternoon, sketching out the foundation plan, "but it'll reach hearts higher than any tower." He spent months working with students from the initiative, mentoring them not just in structure, but in soul. Every line, he told them, should mean something. A building isn't great because it's tall, it's great because it stands for something. When the People's Place finally opened, the entire city came to see it. It wasn't grand or intimidating, it was warm. Sunlight spilled through wide glass windows, trees grew in the courtyard, and children's laughter filled the air. On one of the walls, near the entrance, a quote was etched in simple brass letters: "Dreams don't pay rent, but they can build a home." Elias Carter. People took photos beside it, and for years after, that quote became a mantra for anyone trying to make meaning out of struggle. As time passed, Elias began to withdraw from the public eye, content to let others lead the movement he had started. He still visited the Hensley Carter Tower every week, walking its halls like an old friend visiting home. The staff would nod with reverence, students would stop to shake his hand, and he'd smile at each of them as though he were seeing his younger self reflected in their faces. But age, like gravity, catches everyone. One evening, Grace found him sitting alone on the terrace, staring at the horizon. The sky was painted with streaks of purple and gold. "You shouldn't be up here this late," she said gently. He smiled without looking away. "The city's quieter now. It listens better." She sat beside him. "You know you've changed everything, right?" He chuckled. "I just built what needed building." "No," she said softly. "You built faith." He turned to her, his expression tender but tired. "Promise me something, Grace. Anything. Keep it going. The initiative, the kids, the message." She nodded, her voice steady. "I will." He smiled faintly. "Good. Because I won't always be here to remind them." Not long after that night, Elias Carter passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the blueprints of 1,000 dreams. The city mourned as though it had lost a heartbeat. Newspapers ran headlines that read, "The Janitor Who Built the Future." Flags were lowered, candles lit. Thousands gathered at the steps of the Hensley Carter Tower, leaving flowers, notes, sketches, and mementos. Grace stood before the crowd, her voice carrying steady through the hum of grief. "He didn't build towers to be seen," she said. "He built them so others could stand taller. And now we stand because he did." A week later, a statue was unveiled in the tower's garden. It wasn't grand, just Elias in his janitor's uniform, mop in one hand, blueprint in the other. The plaque beneath it read, "Elias Carter, dreamer, builder, believer." Visitors from around the world came to see it, but the locals didn't come to admire. They came to remember. Grace took over the initiative completely, renaming it the Carter Foundation. Under her leadership, it expanded globally. Schools in Africa, design centers in South America, mentorship programs in Asia, all carrying the name of a man who had once been told he would never matter. And everywhere she went, people shared how his story had reached them, how they'd stopped giving up because they'd heard about the janitor who became an architect. Years later, the city erected a new museum of design dedicated to his life's work. At its entrance stood one of his earliest sketches, creased, smudged, and faded from time. The label read, "Drawn in the quiet of a rented room by a man who believed that even the smallest dream could change the world." And every night, as the lights of the Hensley Carter Tower shimmered across the skyline, it felt as if the city itself whispered his name back to the stars. Elias Carter was gone, but he wasn't. He lived in the walls he built, in the minds he awakened, in the hearts he had lifted. Because true legacy doesn't fade, it echoes. And his echo lived on, in steel and glass, in hope and humanity, forever reminding the world that even the man sweeping the floor might be designing the future. Years passed, like wind moving, through corridors of glass and light. The skyline changed, but one building always stood out, the Hensley Carter Tower. It had become more than a landmark. It was a story made solid. Tourists came to admire its curves and structure, but the locals came to feel its soul. Each morning, sunlight spilled down its sides like a blessing, catching the bronze letters that bore two names, forever intertwined: Hensley and Carter. Inside, time had carried on faithfully. Grace, now older, ran the Carter Foundation with the same purpose Elias had lived by. Her hair had silvered, but her spirit hadn't dulled. Every wall of her office was lined with photos, children holding certificates, students graduating, smiling faces from every corner of the world. The foundation had become a beacon for dreamers, proof that greatness didn't come from wealth or pedigree, but from belief and compassion. Every year on the anniversary of Elias's passing, Grace organized a quiet ceremony. No press, no cameras, just people whose lives he had touched. Architects, students, janitors, teachers, all gathered in the tower's garden beneath the statue of Elias Carter. The bronze had weathered over time, the mop in his hand catching sunlight like a halo. People left flowers, notes, even small sketches. Grace always spoke last. He taught us that every dream deserves a floor to stand on, she'd say softly. And he built that floor for all of us. After the crowds left, she'd sit by the statue alone. Some years, she talked to him out loud. Other years, she just sat in silence. She never doubted that somehow, in the stillness between the city's heartbeat and the wind rustling the trees, he could still hear her. One autumn evening, long after one such ceremony, Grace stayed behind again. The garden lights flickered to life, bathing the statue in warm gold. The city's hum softened in the distance. She rested a hand on the plaque, tracing the letters with care. "You'd laugh if you saw what this has become," she whispered. "We've got schools in 9 countries now. You'd say it's too much paperwork." She smiled to herself. "But they love you everywhere. Kids know your story better than fairy tales. They know that a janitor became a builder and that a dream can rise higher than money." Her eyes glistened. "You were right, Elias. The world just needed someone to stop sweeping past its miracles." The wind stirred gently, carrying the faint sound of city traffic. Grace stood, wrapping her coat tighter. Before leaving, she looked up at the tower, its light shining steady against the dusk. "You're still here," she murmured. "In every brick, every hand that builds." She walked away, her footsteps echoing softly, fading into the evening. Years turned into decades. The foundation outlived its founders, its mission still burning bright. The city had changed, the skyline denser, the buildings smarter, but no one ever dared replace the Hensley Carter Tower. It had become sacred ground, a place where tours began not with architectural jargon, but with a story about a man who cleaned floors and built futures. Teachers brought students there to remind them that greatness has no uniform. Newly hired janitors often left flowers by the statue before their first day, whispering small prayers for courage. The tower had become a living metaphor for everything the city aspired to be: strong, compassionate, and awake to possibility. Then came the centennial of Elias Carter's birth. The city declared it Elias Carter Day. Banners hung across the streets. The mayor unveiled a commemorative stamp bearing his image, the one from the statue, mop in one hand, blueprint in the other. The Carter Foundation hosted a global conference, drawing dreamers and designers from every continent. Grace's successor, a young architect named Malik, gave the keynote speech. He had grown up in the same neighborhood Elias once called home, raised by a single mother who had worked double shifts cleaning offices. "I stand here today," Malik said, "because a man who looked like me, who came from where I come from, refused to let anyone tell him his dream didn't belong in the sky." His voice trembled, but his conviction filled the hall. He didn't just design buildings, he redesigned belief itself. That night, as fireworks lit the city in bursts of color, the tower stood silent, gleaming like a patient witness. Its reflection shimmered across the river, doubled in beauty. For a moment, the light seemed to dance around the statue of Elias Carter, making it look alive again, like the man himself was still smiling somewhere between heaven and the city he'd loved. Inside the tower, an old notebook sat preserved behind glass in the Foundation's museum. Its pages were yellowed, edges torn, but the lines still sang with the neat, steady handwriting of the man who'd written them. On one page, a sketch of a building, his first dream. On the next, a single line in pencil. The day they stop laughing is the day I start building. Visitors read it in. Silence, many wiping tears before moving on. At the museum's exit, a small plaque bore his final recorded words, taken from an interview shortly before his death. You don't have to change the world. Just build something that reminds it how to hope. And that was what he had done. The Hensley Carter Tower, the People's Place, every school, every scholar, they were his reminders. His fingerprints weren't just on blueprints or walls. They were in every act of courage inspired by his story. That night, as the city fell quiet and the river mirrored the skyline, a gentle rain began to fall. Drops slid down the tower's glass like tears. Soft, endless, beautiful. If you stood there long enough, listening, it almost sounded like a heartbeat pulsing beneath the steel. A reminder that what Elias Carter built wasn't just a building, it was a soul that would never stop, whispering to dreamers everywhere, even if the world can't see you yet, build anyway. Decades passed, and the story of Elias Carter became something greater than memory. It became myth wrapped in truth. Children who had never known his voice grew up speaking his name like a prayer, not out of worship, but gratitude. Schools taught his story as part of their history lessons, and his words, simple, honest, unpolished, became mantras for dreamers who came from quiet places. The world had changed. Skyscrapers now touched clouds, cities hummed with technology, and the skyline pulsed like a living machine. Yet amid all that progress, the Hensley Carter Tower still stood as a heartbeat from an older time. A reminder that innovation without humanity was just vanity in disguise. The tower had outlasted generations of architects, outlived corporations, and survived wars of ego and economy. And still it stood, strong, warm, alive, because it had been built not for profit, but for purpose. Inside its walls, the Carter Foundation was thriving. Young architects from all over the world came to study there, carrying stories as varied as their blueprints. Some came from luxury, others from poverty, but all came because they believed in one truth, that brilliance had no background. Each new generation added something to the legacy: sustainable housing projects, green architecture, community-driven design. Elias's vision had evolved, but its heart remained untouched. Design for dignity. Read the motto, etched above the entrance. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a philosophy, a way of life. In the lobby, the statue of Elias Carter still stood in the same place it had for decades, bronze, worn smooth from the countless hands that had touched it for luck or reverence. The mop and blueprint still gleamed in the light. Beneath it, the quote still caught every visitor's eye: dreams don't pay rent, but they can build a home. And beside it, a small plaque had been added years later, in memory of Grace Hensley, who believed when the world doubted. Together they guarded the entrance like sentinels of humility and courage. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, a young girl stood before the statue. She was no more than 10, her backpack nearly as big as she was. Her mother worked as a cleaner in the building, one of many who kept the place running long after the lights dimmed and the city went quiet. The girl looked up at the statue, eyes wide. "Mama?" she asked softly. "Is it true he was like us?" Her mother smiled, brushing dust from her hands. "He was one of us, baby. He never stopped being one of us." The girl nodded slowly, gazing at the bronze face that seemed to smile just for her. "Then maybe one day," she whispered, "I can build something too." Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's the whole point, sweetheart. He already made the floor for you to stand on." That night, after the cleaning crew finished their rounds, the building fell silent again. The lights dimmed one by one, leaving the statue bathed in soft amber glow. Outside, rain began to fall, a light drizzle that painted the glass with streaks of silver. If you listened closely, you could almost hear a hum inside the walls, the same rhythm that once came from a mop gliding across marble, the same sound that once carried a dream too big for one man to hold alone. Far above the city, in the tower's top floor, the Carter Foundation had created a memorial gallery dedicated to Elias's work. It was open day and night, filled with sketches, photographs, and personal notes preserved behind glass. At the center of the room was a single spotlight illuminating his final design, the People's Place. The blueprint, carefully framed, bore his handwriting along the bottom, "For the ones who never stop believing." Beneath it sat a chair, simple and wooden, with a small plaque reading, "Where vision once sat, and the world learned to listen." Visitors often came and sat there, closing their eyes, imagining him working late into the night, whispering lines of faith into the paper until they became buildings. As the decades rolled into centuries, technology transformed the city beyond what anyone had imagined. Drones replaced cars, digital skylines mirrored the real ones, and holograms guided tourists through streets once filled with laughter. But the Hensley Carter Tower remained untouched by modernization. It stood as a monument to something eternal, the human spirit. Scholars called it the Tower of Humility. Pilgrims called it the place of becoming. Every person who visited left a small note tucked near the base of the statue, a name, a wish, a promise. And every morning, the cleaning staff gathered those notes with care, reading a few aloud before preserving them. Some spoke of love, others of struggle, but all carried the same thread: "Thank you for showing me I matter." On the tower's centennial, the world united to celebrate its legacy. Leaders, artists, builders, and everyday citizens came together to honor the man who had changed what it meant to build. The ceremony was broadcast to billions. A holographic projection of Elias appeared beside his statue, reconstructed from old footage and photographs. His voice, steady and warm, filled the plaza. "If I could tell you one thing," it said, "it's that greatness is not measured by how high you climb, but by how many you lift while you rise." The crowd stood in reverent silence as his image smiled faintly, then faded back into light. That night, as fireworks bloomed above the city and reflections rippled across the river, the tower shimmered like it was alive, breathing, remembering. And somewhere, if one could believe in such things, perhaps Elias watched. Maybe from the skyline, maybe from the stars. Maybe he leaned on the edge of heaven, looking down at a world that finally understood what he'd always known, that the janitor and the architect were never two different men. They were one. The rain stopped and the city glowed under a new dawn. The Hensley Carter Tower caught the light first, its glass blazing gold. The bronze letters beneath it gleamed, as if freshly polished. The world kept moving forward, but one truth remained unshaken. Dreams don't fade when they're built with kindness. They live on, solid as stone, echoing forever in the hearts of those brave enough to dream anyway. And so, in the heart of the city, beneath a skyline of miracles and mistakes, stood a tower that whispered through the wind, "You are seen, you are enough, build, bashed."